There are so many mechanics in Paradox games that we, as YouTube content creators for these games, have a tendency to take for granted what we consider to be common knowledge among the fanbase. It is very crude, but alas, it is difficult to go through step by step every little nuance when you're in the middle of an already highly nuanced guide that is limited in scope by time in particular. In my particular case, I have a tendency to gloss over the voting laws, usually when I'm making a YouTube short or guide. I do so with the understanding that everybody will either take me at my word or is knowledgeable enough about the game to immediately understand why I'm making certain suggestions. My YouTube shorts in particular are bad for this because I'm literally trying to keep the length of my shorts down as much as possible. Well people, now this video will exist. I'm going to give you a quick glossary explanation as to the value of each and every distribution of power system that there is in the game. I will also highlight the ones that I feel are the most useful, so be prepared for me to glaze some over the others. Your particular favorites might not get highlighted, so be prepared. Census Suffrage and Anarchy fans in particular will not like what I'm about to say, so please, brace yourselves. But before we begin, please take a moment to like and subscribe. Every little bit helps me in the YouTube algorithm and it keeps me from disappearing into the ether. You guys are kings. Anyhow, let's get into the video. It shouldn't come as any surprise that this is considered the worst distribution of power law in the game, simply because it was designed to be changed at every opportunity. Most countries will start with this law, and you're supposed to want to move off of it as soon as possible due to the rather sizable penalties that'll make modernizing very difficult if you happen to stay on Autocracy. The biggest issues with Autocracy obviously stem from the huge amount of political strength afforded to aristocrats and officers, coupled with the gargantuan amount of penalties for ideological incompatibility. I personally can't think of any situation where Autocracy will ever be actively helpful to a player. For the most part, it'll just keep the landowners in power, which is pretty much the one thing you're not supposed to want, especially now with corn laws nerfed. There is a reason why Technocracy is not given to you early on in the game. It grants a sizable amount of political strength to academics and engineers who have a strong tendency to favor the intelligentsia, industrialists, and petite bourgeoisie. That makes Technocracy a very powerful pick for anybody who has the intention of keeping the intelligentsia strong throughout their playthrough in particular. In fact, it's one of the only laws that'll keep the intelligentsia strong after the 1900s. The trade unions do have a tendency to favor this law, but ironically they are not very well served by Technocracy since they are much more likely to be favored by low wealth threshold people until the Vanguard events, which is when the engineers finally start supporting the trade unions. Weirdly enough, Oligarchy can actually be very difficult to get sometimes because it is often only supported by the industrialists. The landowners already have their autocracy, so they have no reason to move on, while the intelligentsia and rural folk want nothing to do with this law. That usually means that only the industrialists in most cases will want Oligarchy, and there is a very good reason why. They will immediately be boosted by the political strength towards capitalists. Oligarchy naturally is much more flexible than Autocracy in that it has far less ideological incompatibility issues. However, the downside is that landowners are still very much empowered by the gigantic bonuses to the aristocrats. Now comes perhaps my very first actual disliked law. Landed voting is almost always accompanied with wealth voting, yet, unlike wealth voting, it does very little to empower the industrialists and the intelligentsia, especially since the intelligentsia's usual supporters are disenfranchised by this law. In fact, landed voting keeps the landowners ultra powerful while offering parity between the clergy and the industrialists. Add on the ideological incompatibility issues and you'll rarely be able to pull the industrialists into office simply because they'll often be paired up with the intelligentsia, and the intelligentsia will almost never want to be in the same government as the clergy, who is often paired up with the landowners. I won't go so far as to call this a beginner's trap, but I need people to understand why I never advocate for landed voting. Wealth voting is just better. Wealth voting is perhaps the greatest early game law. Though there is a sizable plus 25 wealth threshold for voting, no one profession is disenfranchised, so long as the people are over the wealth threshold. Believe it or not, this is actually a boon for you. Industrialists and the intelligentsia are much more likely to end up over the 25 wealth threshold, almost guaranteeing that the both of them will have a very sizable amount of legitimacy given to them by votes, which is amazing because they will almost always be weak when it comes to clout in the early game. With a few smart journal entry choices during the election cycle, you can quickly disempower the landowner/clergy party and empower the industrialist/intelligentsia party. Then, before you know it, you're in the driver's seat towards modernizing your country because the industrialists and the intelligentsia will be in the government even if your leader is a landowner monarch. Just be ready to move off of wealth voting the moment you get your early game economic laws, cultural exclusion, total separation, and no migration controls done. This is probably the greatest beginner's trap in the game. In a lot of scenarios, you will actually be able to pass census suffrage around the same time that you would be able to pass wealth voting, and because census suffrage is further down the list, people have a tendency to pick this one over the amazing wealth voting. That unfortunately is not a wise decision, and you will likely run into early game issues like the petite bourgeoisie becoming ultra powerful, or if you paired census suffrage up with another law like homesteading, you will be stuck with the rural folk in power for the next 100 years. This is because the wealth threshold is only 15, which can easily be passed by shopkeepers and farmers. Shopkeepers are much more likely to support the petite bourgeoisie, while farmers will obviously prefer the rural folk. Neither of these groups are preferable, and it can really stall your modernizing efforts if you get stuck with them. Thankfully, universal suffrage is not a beginner's trap because you actually require the egalitarianism law, which will usually take people at the very least 10 or so years to grab, even if they're beelining for it. However, I would highly suggest against taking the universal suffrage too early anyways. One of the main benefits of universal suffrage comes from the fact that it has a complete lack of a threshold and it does not disenfranchise anybody. Every single person gets a chance to vote for the exact same amount of political strength. Overall, this law is absolutely amazing in the mid-game to late game, but first, you want to make darn certain that your people support the industrialists, intelligentsia, and trade unions. This often means that you don't want your people to be predominantly farmers or peasants, because if they are, you will once more be stuck with the rural folk for 100 years. Of course, if you already see the trade unions becoming very powerful and you want to guarantee that they stay successful, this is the perfect law to pick. In fact, this is probably the final law that most people are going to pick. Whew boy. I do not like this law. For one, it requires a very late game technology to be picked and a very late game law to be picked prior to taking Anarchy in the first place. Yet, the reward for doing so is an inferior version of Technocracy that favors the trade unions over the intelligentsia. I have to remind you, you do not need Anarchy for anything. It does nothing that other distribution of power laws do. In fact, Anarchy actually penalizes you by completely having your authority to do what other laws do just as well, if not better. I will go on record and state that you will never need the +2 government size allowance in the late game. You should in fact already be fully modernized by the time you're even able to get Anarchy, so there is zero purpose to being able to have multiple groups in power. You should instead just focus on one or the other of industrialists, intelligentsia, and trade unions. Even if you aren't worried about modernizing, but you want to go fasci or communi, well, again, there are far better laws to pick. Technocracy is a good example, as is our final law. Going fasci really isn't that difficult. You get so many agitators thrown at you and there are so many events put in your way that you actually have to go out of your way to avoid becoming fasci. Going communi, on the other hand, is a much harder path to take. That is actually where single-party state comes in. While you could very easily just use universal suffrage to keep the trade unionists in power once they become preferred, it is far easier to maintain huge amounts of legitimacy as a single-party state after you've gone republic and put the trade union in power. Single-party state, as a result, is probably the most powerful distribution of power law in the game if used correctly. It pretty much guarantees that whoever you put into power prior to enacting this law stays in power for the rest of the game with very little effort needed from you afterwards. I'd like to thank you for watching this far into the video. I understand that not everybody is going to agree with my assessments, but I do hope that there are at least a few people out there who understand why I feel the way I do about certain laws. Now, I typically do guides, rants, and playthroughs, so if you're actually interested in that sort of thing, click here to watch my most recent rant about Paradox's tendency to add feature creep to their games. Anyhow, good night, and I hope you enjoy playing Victoria 3. Just always remember, Hail Hydra Cat.